The rising Arizona sun cast long shadows across Martha Holloway's weathered ranch, once thriving, now barely holding on since her husband's passing. Through squinted eyes, she watched the Apache man dismount his paint horse, his movements careful yet confident. He had hands that looked like they could break bones or mend the most delicate things. A reputation for few words but honest work. She needed help for just one day, nothing more. Martha had learned the hard way that depending on others only led to disappointment. But as he stood silently waiting for instruction, something in his steady gaze suggested a patience born from enduring life's harshest seasons. Could this stranger, whose name she could barely pronounce, be the one person who wouldn't abandon her when times got tough? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha Holloway's fingers moved automatically to the pocket watch hanging from the nail beside the kitchen door. A morning ritual unchanged since James died. Wind it. Check the time. Slide her thumb across the worn inscription. To James, with love always. 2 years gone. Yet his presence lingered in every corner of the ranch they'd built together. She tucked a strand of graying hair behind her ear and squinted through the kitchen window at the Apache man working on the fence line. His movements were efficient, methodical, no wasted motion. The Holloway Ranch had once been the pride of Copper Creek Valley. 15 years ago, she and James had arrived with nothing but determination and dreams, transforming a broken-down homestead into a respectable cattle operation. Now, half her herd was gone, sold to keep the bank at bay. The ledger book on her table told the story in cold, unforgiving numbers. 3 more months before Walsh from the bank would come calling again. Should have sold last year, Martha muttered, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. Clayton Harris, owner of the neighboring Double H, had made offers, each one lower than the last. She could still see his smug expression. A woman alone can't manage a spread this size, he'd said, not bothering to hide his certainty that she'd fail. The Apache, Nakohe he'd called himself, had appeared yesterday at her gate like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared voice. Word traveled fast in these parts, and when 3 head of cattle had broken through the north fence, Martha had reluctantly put out word that she needed help. The last ranch hand had left 6 months ago when she couldn't pay his wages. Since then, she'd managed alone, rising before dawn and working until her bones ached with exhaustion. Pride kept her going. Stubbornness, James would have called it, with that half-smile that had first won her heart back in Ohio. She watched the Apache secure a post with powerful strikes of the hammer. He'd quoted her 1 day's work for a fair price, just long enough to mend the fence, patch the roof where it leaked above the storage room, and be gone. That was all she could afford, all she would allow herself to need. From the barn came the nervous whinny of Thunder, her prized stallion. The horse had been James's last gift to her before pneumonia took him during that terrible winter. Like her, the animal had grown wary of strangers. Martha poured a second cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The Apache glanced up at her approach but continued working, his dark eyes giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Brought you some coffee," she said, setting the mug on a fence post within his reach. He nodded once, wiping his hands on his worn canvas pants before taking the mug. "Thank you." His voice was deeper than she expected, the words accented but clear. Up close, she noticed the small leather pouch hanging from a cord around his neck. Some tribal medicine, perhaps. She'd heard stories about the Apache ways but knew little beyond rumor and gossip. "The fence coming along all right?" she asked, knowing the answer was obvious. "Yes, wood is old. Should hold through winter, though." She nodded, scanning the horizon where dark clouds gathered over the distant mountains. The first storms would arrive within weeks. Everything needed to be secured before then, the barn, the house, the remaining cattle. Tasks that once would have been handled by 3 men, now falling to her alone. "I'll need to check the roof next," he said, following her gaze to the clouds. "Rain coming soon." Martha tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "Just 1 day, that's all I'm paying for. Get as much done as you can." He regarded her steadily, his expression unreadable. "1 day," he agreed, but something in his tone suggested he saw more work than could possibly fit within those boundaries. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught on the ledger book visible through the window. The columns of red figures seemed to mock her determination. One day of help wouldn't save the ranch. Nothing would, most likely. But she'd be damned if she didn't fight until the very end. Nakohi felt the woman's eyes on him as he worked. The widow Holloway watched from various windows of the house, pretending not to when he glanced her way. He understood her wariness. A strange Apache man on her property. He'd seen that look of cautious assessment many times before. He secured another fence post, his hands finding the rhythm of the work easily. The small medicine pouch against his chest shifted as he moved. His grandfather had given it to him when he was 10, the year the government men came to take him to the school. "This will help you remember who you are," the old man had whispered, pressing the leather pouch into his palm. "Even when they try to make you forget." For 7 years, he'd hidden it from the teachers who cut his hair and forbade his language. 7 years of learning the white man's ways before returning to find himself a stranger among his own people. Now, at 36, Nakohi walked a path between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The widow appeared at the corner of the barn, checking his progress without approaching. Her face was lined with worry and hard work, her body lean and weathered like the land itself. There was a stubbornness in her stance that reminded him of the old women on the reservation who had outlived husbands and children and still tended their gardens each spring. "Your north pasture has weak spots in the fencing," he called to her. "Not just where the cattle broke through." She approached reluctantly, arms crossed. "I can only pay you to fix what we agreed on." "I'm telling you, not offering," he replied. "Knowledge costs nothing." Something flickered across her face. Pride wrestling with practicality. "I'll see to it when I can." Nakohi nodded, returning to his work. He'd heard about the Holloway widow in town. How her husband had died 2 winters back. How she refused to sell to Clayton Harris despite mounting debts. The ranchers in the saloon had placed bets on how long she'd last. "She's stubborn as a mule," one had said. But stubborn don't feed cattle or fix fences. The sun climbed higher as he worked, the day growing warmer. He removed his worn canvas jacket, revealing the faded blue shirt beneath. Unlike many Apache men who'd returned from the schools, he'd kept his hair long, tied back with a simple leather cord. A quiet defiance and reminder of who he was beneath the white man's clothes. At midday, she brought him a plate of beans and cornbread. Simple fare, but he noted how she'd taken care with it. The cornbread still warm, a small pat of precious butter melting on top. "You work quickly," she said, watching as he washed his hands with water from the pump before accepting the plate. "Work is work. It doesn't improve by stretching it out." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Most men I've hired find ways to make a day's job last 3. I'm not most men." He sat on an overturned bucket to eat. "No, I don't suppose you are." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the silence between them. "Your name, Nakohi. What does it mean?" He paused, surprised by her interest and her attempt to pronounce his name correctly. "Bear," he answered. "It was my grandfather's name before mine." She nodded, as if filing away this small piece of information. "Well, Mr. Nakohi." "Just Nakohi," he corrected gently. "Nakohi, then." She gestured toward the roof. "The patch job won't take much. There's a loose section above the storeroom. If you finish the fence in time." "I'll finish," he assured her, returning to his meal. As she walked away, he noticed how her shoulders carried the weight of the ranch, how her eyes constantly scanned for the next problem to solve. A woman used to handling everything alone, suspicious of help even when she needed it. Nakohi understood this too. Some burdens were harder to share than others. Martha woke before dawn, the old house creaking around her as a cool breeze slipped through the window. She'd slept fitfully, her dreams filled with falling fence posts and rising floodwaters. The first light hadn't yet broken the horizon when she pulled her faded robe around her shoulders and made her way to the kitchen. The coffee was just beginning to percolate when she noticed movement outside. Nakohi was already at work, a lantern hanging from a nearby post as he examined the roof. She watched, coffee forgotten, as he methodically removed a broken tile, turning it over in his hands before setting it aside. He wasn't supposed to be here. Their agreement had been for one day yesterday. She'd paid him at sundown, counting out the coins carefully from her dwindling reserves. He had nodded, pocketed the payment, and ridden away on his paint horse. She'd assumed that was the end of it. Yet here he was, moving across her roof with the sureness of a man who knew exactly what needed fixing. Martha pushed open the kitchen door, the morning air sharp against her skin. "What are you doing here?" she called up, her voice carrying in the pre-dawn stillness. Nakohi glanced down at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Roof won't hold through first big rain. Fixing it." "I didn't ask you to come back." "No," he agreed, returning to his work. "You didn't." Martha stood barefoot on the porch, uncertainty keeping her rooted in place. Pride urged her to send him away. She hadn't asked for charity. But practicality whispered that the roof did need fixing, and her own attempts had been temporary patches at best. "I can't pay you more," she said finally. "Not until after the cattle sale next month, maybe." He nodded, removing another cracked tile. "I know. Then why are you here?" Nakohi paused, seeming to consider her question carefully. "Work needs doing," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Martha shook her head, retreating into the kitchen to pour her coffee. Through the window, she watched him work, his movements economical and precise. There was something both unsettling and comforting about his presence. This man who spoke little but saw much. At the government school, they'd tried to beat his language out of him. Nakohi remembered the sting of the ruler across his knuckles when he forgot and slipped into Apache. "English only," the teacher would say. "You must forget those savage ways." But at night, alone on his thin mattress, he would silently name everything he could see in his native tongue, keeping the words alive inside himself. They'd taught him to read and write, to cipher numbers, to farm the white man's way. Useful skills, he had to admit. Skills that helped him navigate between worlds. But they couldn't make him forget who he was, where he came from. The medicine pouch against his chest reminded him of that every day. By mid-morning, Martha had dressed and prepared a simple breakfast. She hesitated, then made enough for two. When she brought a plate and cup to the edge of the house, Nakohi climbed down from the roof, wiping his hands on his pants before accepting the food. "Found more broken tiles than I thought," he said, gesturing with his coffee cup toward a small pile. "Old ones. Brittle." Martha nodded, noticing how he'd carefully set aside the broken pieces rather than discarding them. "Can they be fixed?" "Some. Others need replacing." He took a bite of the cornbread, chewing thoughtfully. "I know a place to find good clay. Could make new ones that match." She studied him, trying to understand his motives. "Why would you do that?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "I told you, work needs doing. And you just do work that needs doing? For no pay." "Did I say no pay?" He finished his coffee. "Maybe we trade." "I don't have anything to trade." "You have food. Shelter for my horse." He gestured toward the pasture where his paint grazed contentedly. "And you fixed my shirt." Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks. She had indeed noticed the torn sleeve of his shirt yesterday and mended it while he was working on the fence. A simple kindness she hadn't even thought about. "That was nothing," she murmured. "Not to me," he replied, handing her the empty plate. Their fingers brushed, just for a moment. Small things matter. 3 days stretched into a week. Martha found herself settling into a rhythm with Nakohi's presence. They worked mostly in silence, she tending to the cattle and garden, he repairing what years of neglect had worn down. Their conversations remained practical, focused on the work, yet something was shifting between them, a wordless understanding built through shared labor. In the evenings, after supper, Nakohi would sit on the porch steps, a small piece of wood in his hands. Martha watched through the window as he carefully carved, his large hands surprisingly delicate as they shaped the wood. One night, Curiosity overcame her reserve, and she joined him outside, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling desert air. "What are you making?" she asked, settling on the other end of the step. He turned the carving in his palm, the rough shape of a horse emerging from the pine. "Something to pass the time." Martha nodded, recognizing the graceful arch of the neck, the powerful stance. "Looks like thunder. Strong animal. Proud." He worked a small knife along the wood. "Doesn't trust easily. James brought him home as a colt. Said he had fire in his eyes." She smiled at the memory. Thunder wouldn't let anyone but James near him for months. Nakohi nodded, continuing his carving. "Some creatures need time to decide if you're worth trusting." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. Martha looked out across the darkening ranch, the silhouette of the mountains black against the indigo sky. "James and I came west 15 years ago. Everyone said I was crazy to leave Ohio, to follow him out to nothing but dust and dreams. Were they right? Sometimes I wondered." She traced a crack in the wooden step with her finger. "First years were hard. Drought, sickness, more work than seems possible for two people. But we built something good here. And now you fight to keep it. It's all I have left of him, of us." The admission felt raw, exposed. She hadn't spoken these words aloud to anyone. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the gentle scrape of his knife against wood the only sound besides the chirping of night insects. "Tomorrow I'll start on the corral," Nakohi said finally. "The gate needs new hinges. I've been meaning to fix that for months." Martha hesitated. "I appreciate the help, but I still don't understand why you're doing all this." Nakohi was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "My people say that a person's worth is measured by what they contribute, not what they take." He held up the half-finished carving, examining it in the fading light. "My grandfather taught me to leave places better than I found them." The next morning, Martha watched from the barn as Nakohi approached Thunder's stall. The stallion snorted and pawed nervously, his ears flattened in warning. Most men would have backed away. Thunder had nearly taken a ranch hand's finger off last year, but Nakohi simply stood still, murmuring words she couldn't understand. Patchy words, she realized, soft and melodic. Gradually, the horse's ears perked forward. His nervous movements stilled. Martha held her breath as Nakohi slowly extended his hand. Palm up. Thunder stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as he scented the stranger. Then, to her amazement, the stallion nudged Nakohi's palm with his muzzle. "How did you do that?" she asked when Nakohi emerged from the stall. Spoke to him as an equal, not a thing to be controlled. He wiped his hands on a rag. "He's been lonely too." Martha felt something catch in her throat. "I'm not lonely. I'm independent." The look Nakohi gave her was gentle but knowing. Those aren't always different things. Later, watching him repair the corral gate, Martha found herself studying his movements, the way the muscles in his arms worked beneath his shirt, the quiet concentration in his face. It had been a long time since she'd really looked at a man. The realization made her turn away quickly, busying herself with gathering eggs from the henhouse. That evening, as she prepared supper, she noticed a small wooden horse placed carefully on the kitchen windowsill. The carving captured Thunder's spirit perfectly, head high, ready to run. Martha touched it lightly, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. Martha's weathered almanac lay open on the kitchen table, its pages dog-eared and annotated with her careful handwriting. Each evening, she consulted it, tracking the moon phases and weather predictions with the dedication of someone whose livelihood depended on reading the seasons correctly. Tonight, her finger traced the coming week's forecast with growing concern. "Early rains," she murmured, glancing out the window where dark clouds gathered on the distant horizon. The storm season wasn't due for another 3 weeks, but the almanac had warned of unusual patterns this year. Martha had circled the prediction months ago, making notes about preparations needed. Nakohi appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. 2 weeks had passed since he'd first arrived, and still he came each morning, worked alongside her all day, and departed at sunset. Their arrangement remained unspoken but understood. Meals and a small wage when she could manage it in exchange for his labor. "Storm's coming," he said, nodding toward the window. "Almanac says we've got 3 days, maybe 4. Martha closed the book, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. "The barn roof won't hold if it's a heavy one." Nakohi nodded. "Was thinking the same. We should reinforce the north wall too. Wood's rotted at the base." Martha frowned. "The north wall? It seemed solid enough last time I checked. Water damage from last season. Didn't show until I removed some boards." He sat at the table when she gestured to the chair. "Take 2 days to fix properly." 2 days, Martha repeated, mental calculations running through her head. The cattle sale money wouldn't come for another week, and her reserves were nearly depleted. "I don't know if we can—" The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her. Through the window, she spotted Clayton Harris riding up the path to her house. His expensive bay stallion a sharp contrast to the practical paint horse Nakohi rode. "Harris?" she muttered, her mouth tightening into a thin line. Nakohi watched her face, noted the tension that immediately stiffened her shoulders. "Trouble. Neighbor. Wants my land." She stood, smoothing her apron from habit. "Has since James died." Harris's voice boomed from outside. "Martha, got a minute?" Martha opened the door to find Clayton Harris already dismounting, his tall frame casting a long shadow across her porch. In his 40s, with a prosperous belly straining against his vest, Harris owned the largest spread in the county and made sure everyone knew it. "Afternoon, Clayton," she said coolly. "What brings you by?" "Thought I'd check in. See how you're faring with storm season approaching." His gaze slid past her to where Nakohi sat at the kitchen table. Something hard flashed in Harris's eyes. "Didn't know you had company." Martha stepped onto the porch, pulling the door partially closed behind her. "Mr. Nakohi is helping with some repairs." "An Apache?" Harris raised his eyebrows. "Didn't think you'd be the type to hire—" "Well, times must be harder than I thought." The condescension in his tone made Martha's spine stiffen. "He does good work. What do you really want, Clayton?" Harris leaned against the porch railing, attempting a casual air. "Just being neighborly. Saw those clouds building and thought about your situation." He lowered his voice. "My offer still stands, Martha. More than fair considering the state of this place. You could have a nice little house in town. No more worrying about cattle or crops or—" He nodded toward the door. "Having to hire just anybody willing to work." Before Martha could respond, the door opened, and Nakohi stepped onto the porch. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice neutral. "Where would you like me to store the new roof supports?" Harris straightened, his hand instinctively moving closer to the pistol at his hip. "You interrupting a private conversation, boy?" Nakohi's expression remained impassive, but Martha saw the slight tightening around his eyes at the disrespectful address. She stepped between them. "Mr. Nakohi is my employee, Clayton, and we're discussing ranch business, which concerns him." "Employee?" Harris snorted. "Can't imagine what you're paying him with. Unless—" His implication hung in the air, crude and deliberate. Martha felt heat rush to her face. "I think you should leave now." Harris shrugged, but his eyes were cold. "Just looking out for you, Martha. Woman alone out here, taking in strays. People talk." He glanced at Nakohi. "Some folks in town might not like hearing about your arrangement." "My arrangements are my business," Martha said firmly. "Good day, Clayton." After Harris rode away, Martha remained on the porch, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles whitened. Nakohi stood silently beside her. "I apologize for that," she said finally. "No need. I've heard worse." She turned to look at him, really look at him. "That doesn't make it right." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at her defense of him. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." That night at supper, they ate in a silence heavier than usual. Martha couldn't stop hearing Harris's insinuations, couldn't erase the image of his smug, knowing smile. "The barn roof," she said abruptly. "You're right. We should reinforce it before the storm. The old rifle hung above the fireplace, its wooden stock polished by years of handling. Martha's father had carried it during the war between the states, had taught her to shoot with it when she was barely tall enough to hold it steady. A woman alone needs to protect herself, he'd said. Those words had returned to her often since James died. Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the tall grass in waves across the pasture. Martha and Nakohi worked side by side on the barn roof, racing against the approaching storm. The clouds on the horizon had grown darker, more threatening. "Hand me those nails," Martha said, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cool breeze. Nakohi passed them without comment, his own movements quick but thorough. They'd fallen into an efficient partnership over the past days. Martha found herself anticipating his needs, passing tools before he asked, just as he seemed to know when to take over a task that strained her strength. It was a dance they'd learned without instruction, born of shared purpose and growing respect. "My husband would have liked you," Martha said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. Nakohi glanced at her, hammering another shingle into place. "Why do you say that?" "James valued competence above all else. Said you could tell a person's character by how they did the work no one was watching." She secured her side of the beam they were reinforcing. He didn't care where a person came from, only who they chose to be. Nakohi was quiet for a long moment. "My wife was like that," he said finally. Kimmy saw people for themselves, not the stories others told about them. Martha paused, the hammer still in her hand. It was the first time he'd mentioned a wife. "I didn't know you were married." "Was. Fever took her 5 winters ago." His face remained composed, but something in his voice revealed the depth of the loss. "And our unborn child with her." "I'm sorry," Martha said softly, the words inadequate but sincere. Nakohi nodded, returning to his work. "As I am for your James." They worked in silence after that, but it was different than before. A silence of shared understanding rather than cautious distance. Two people who knew the shape of grief, the weight of carrying on alone. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had claimed half the sky. The air felt heavy, electric with the promise of rain. They had just descended from the barn roof when the sound of an approaching wagon reached them. "We've got company," Martha said, shading her eyes against the fading sun. Nakohi tensed beside her. "The banker," he said, recognizing the black buggy cresting the hill. Emmett Walsh sat rigidly on the seat, his tailored suit and derby hat marking him as a town man. The bank manager had never liked getting his polished shoes dusty on ranch visits, which meant his presence boded ill. "Mrs. Holloway," Walsh called, pulling his horse to a stop. His gaze slid over Nakohi with barely disguised distaste before returning to Martha. "I see you've hired help." "Mr. Walsh," Martha acknowledged coolly. "What brings the Copper Creek Bank all the way out here? Payments not due for another 3 weeks." Walsh climbed down from his buggy, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. "That's precisely why I've come. There's been a change in the terms of your loan." Martha felt her stomach drop. "What kind of change?" "The board has decided to call in certain high-risk loans early." Walsh extracted a document from his breast pocket. "This property has been underperforming for some time now. We require full payment by the end of the month." "That's impossible," Martha said, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. "You know I can't manage that until after the fall sale." Walsh's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps Mr. Harris might be interested in helping you out of this predicament. I understand he's made several generous offers." Martha felt Nakohi move slightly closer to her side, a silent show of support. "This is my home, Mr. Walsh. My land. The bank agreed to terms, and I've never missed a payment. Business decisions, Mrs. Holloway. Nothing personal." Walsh handed her the document. "You have until the end of the month." As the banker returned to his buggy, Martha unfolded the notice with trembling fingers. The legal language swam before her eyes, but the meaning was clear enough. They wanted her land, and they'd found a way to take it. "He and Harris are working together," Nako, he said quietly once Walsh had departed. Martha nodded, the paper crumpling in her grip. James always said Walsh was in Harris's pocket. She turned toward the house, her back straight despite the blow. Storm's almost here. We'd better finish battening down. Only when she reached the safety of her kitchen did Martha allow her composure to crack. The document fell to the table as she pressed her palms against the worn wood, fighting to control her breathing. Years of work, of memories, of holding on through impossible odds. All to end like this? A soft knock at the door. Nako stood there, his expression grave but steady. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. The bank notice lay on the kitchen table between them. Its official letterhead and read "Foreclosure Warning," stamped like a wound against the worn wood. Rain had begun to fall outside, gentle at first but growing steadier, drumming against the newly repaired roof. "They can't do this," Martha said, more to herself than to Nako. The payment schedule was clear. 3 more weeks. Nako studied the document with a careful eye. During his years at the government school, he'd learned to read the white man's legal language, to understand the words they used to take what wasn't theirs. "They've added new conditions," he noted, pointing to a paragraph of small print. "Interest rate increased because of elevated risk assessment." Martha leaned closer to read where his finger indicated. Her lips tightened. That wasn't in the original agreement. James would never have signed something with these terms. May not have been there when he signed. Nako's voice was matter-of-fact. He had seen this before. Papers that changed after signatures were dry, terms that shifted like sand underfoot. Martha pushed away from the table, pacing the small kitchen. 30 years my family's been ranching. Never once failed to honor our word or pay our debts. Her voice trembled with barely contained fury. And they do this thievery with paper and ink instead of a gun. Through the window, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the yard where they'd worked side by side these past weeks. The repairs they'd made, the fences mended, the roof that no longer leaked. All of it could belong to Clayton Harris within days. "What will you do?" Nako asked quietly. Martha stopped her pacing, her gaze falling on her husband's rifle above the fireplace. For a wild moment, she imagined confronting Walsh and Harris, demanding justice at gunpoint. The fantasy faded as quickly as it had formed. Violence wouldn't save her home. "I don't know," she admitted, the words difficult to speak aloud. "The cattle aren't ready for market. The prices would be too low now anyway." She ran a hand through her graying hair. "I could sell some of the breeding stock, but that's mortgaging the future to save the present." Thunder rumbled, closer now. The storm was upon them, just as they'd predicted, just as they'd prepared for. But this other storm, this threat to everything she'd built. There had been no warning, no time to ready herself. "Harris came to see me in town last week," Nako said unexpectedly. Martha turned sharply. "What? You never mentioned this." "Nothing to mention until now." He met her gaze steadily. "Offered me twice your wage to leave. Said a smart Indian would know which side his bread was buttered on." "That snake," Martha hissed. "And you didn't take it? Why?" The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Nako looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Made a promise," he said finally, "to help with the repairs." "1 day of repairs," Martha reminded him. "That was our agreement. You've stayed weeks now. Some promises grow." He shrugged, as if the choice had been simple. "Besides, Harris is a man who believes everything has a price. Some things don't." Martha felt something catch in her throat. This man who owed her nothing had refused money, good money, to stand by her. In a world where her neighbors, the bank, even the law seemed aligned against her, Nako had chosen her side. "What do we do now?" she asked, the "we" slipping out before she could catch it. If Nako noticed the change, he gave no sign. "First, we finish securing the ranch against the storm. Then we fight the other storm." "Fight how?" "I can't outbid Harris, and the banks made it clear where they stand. There are other ways to win than with money." Nako stood, his decision made. But you need to be sure. If I stay to help, Harris will make things harder. For both of us. Martha understood what he wasn't saying. An Apache man standing with a white woman against powerful men like Harris and Walsh. There would be talk, threats, perhaps worse. The path of least resistance would be to sell, to take what little they offered, to walk away. But Martha Holloway had never chosen the easy path. "I'm not giving up my home," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "If you're willing to stay, I'd be grateful for the help." Outside, the storm raged. Wind howling around the corners of the house they'd worked together to secure. But inside, in the warm light of the kitchen, something new had taken root. An alliance, a partnership, perhaps something more that neither was ready to name. Morning after the storm broke clear and fresh, the desert air washed clean of dust. Martha spread the ranch map across the kitchen table, its corners weighed down with cups and a salt cellar. The yellow document showed the full extent of the Holloway property. 800 acres of grazing land, a creek that ran year-round, timber stands in the northern section, and boundaries marked with neighboring ranches. James marked all the property lines himself, Martha said, her finger tracing the carefully drawn borders. Rode every inch to make sure the survey was accurate. Nakohe studied the map, his eyes taking in the details that had made this land worth fighting for. Good water source, protected grazing. That's why Harris wants it. The creek would give him control of water access for miles. She pointed to where their property connected to the Double H Ranch. "He's been buying up all the small spreads around here, one by one." They had spent the morning assessing damage from the storm. A few fence sections down, some minor flooding in the lower pasture, but overall, their preparations had held. The barn roof, reinforced just in time, hadn't leaked a drop. "If we're going to save this place," Martha continued, "we need to make it profitable enough to pay off the loan. Fast." She circled an area on the map. "The north pasture has the best grass. If we move the remaining breeding stock there, fatten them up quick." "Good start," Nakohe agreed. "But cattle take time. Need something faster too." He was right. Even with optimal grazing, the cattle wouldn't bring enough at market to cover what they needed. Martha ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. "The timber," Nakohe suggested, pointing to the northern section, "could sell some, not all." Martha considered this. The stand of pines on the north ridge was mature, worth good money. James had always considered it their emergency fund. "That might work, but we'd need help to fell and transport it. I know men, good workers, patchy like me, looking for honest pay." Martha hesitated only briefly. A month ago, she might have balked at the suggestion of bringing more Apache men onto her land. Now the idea seemed natural. "Can they start soon?" Nakohe nodded. "Can ride to the reservation tomorrow. Be back with help in 2 days." They continued planning through the morning, identifying every possible resource the ranch could offer. Martha felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since James died. For 2 years, she'd been merely surviving, holding ground. Now, with Nakohe across the table offering suggestions, challenging her thinking, supporting her ideas, she was fighting back. "There's something else," Martha said hesitantly. "The South Quarter has always had good clay deposits. James and I talked about making bricks someday." She traced the area on the map. "Never had the time or manpower to try it." "Clay?" Nakohe repeated, interest lighting his eyes. "I worked at a brickyard near the school. Know the process." He studied the map location. "Could be valuable. Need to test the quality." "You think it could work?" "Worth trying." He met her gaze. "Need every advantage now." By midday, they had outlined a plan, moving cattle to better pasture, selective timber harvesting, and testing the clay deposits. It wasn't guaranteed to save the ranch, but it gave them a fighting chance. As they finished their planning, Martha rolled up the map carefully. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for helping." Nakohe nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Your home is worth fighting for." Something in his tone made Martha look up sharply. There was more behind those words, an understanding of what it meant to lose one's home, one's place in the world. She remembered stories she'd heard about the Apache people being forced from their traditional lands, relocated to reservations not of their choosing. Nakohi, she said, testing his name carefully on her tongue. It was the first time she'd used it directly, instead of Mr. Nakohi or no name at all. Why does this matter to you? Truly? He was silent for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains visible through the window. When you lose your land, you lose part of yourself, he said finally. I've seen it happen to my people. Too many times. He looked back at her, his gaze steady. No one should have their home taken by men with paper weapons. Martha felt something shift between them, a deepening of understanding, of shared purpose. This wasn't just about a business arrangement anymore. They were allies in a fight that mattered to them both, for reasons that went beyond mere property. We should get started then, she said, rolling up her sleeves. There's much to do. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge as Martha and Nakohi rode along the northern boundary of the ranch. 3 days had passed since they'd formed their plan, and every hour since had been dedicated to its execution. Today's mission: locate and recover the half-dozen cattle that had wandered through a gap in the fence onto Harris's land. Tracks lead this way, Nakohi said, pointing to hoof prints in the soft earth. The recent rain had made tracking easier, a small blessing in their difficult situation. Martha nodded, adjusting her hat against the rising sun. She rode Thunder, who had become surprisingly accepting of Nakohi's presence. The stallion that once allowed only her to approach now responded to the Apache's quiet commands as readily as her own. Harris's men patrol this section every other day, she said, scanning the rolling landscape ahead. If we're lucky, we can find our stock and be gone before they ride through. They followed the tracks for nearly an hour, moving deeper into Harris's territory. Martha felt the tension building in her shoulders. Being caught here could mean trouble, accusations of trespassing, perhaps worse. But those cattle represented a significant portion of her remaining herd. They couldn't afford to lose them. Nakohi raised his hand suddenly, signaling her to stop. He pointed to a small depression ahead where a group of cattle grazed peacefully around a seasonal pond. Among them were the distinctive roan coloring of Martha's missing stock. There, he said, all 6, still together. Relief flooded through Martha. Thank goodness. Let's get them home before. The sound of approaching horses cut her off. From the ridge to their west came 3 riders, the morning sun glinting off the rifle one carried across his saddle. Harris's men, Martha whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the pistol at her hip. Nakohi assessed the situation quickly. No cover here. No running without leaving the cattle. The riders spotted them, changing course to intercept. Martha recognized the leader, Bill Larson, Harris's foreman, a man with a mean streak and unwavering loyalty to his boss. Well, look what we found, Larson called as they approached. Mrs. Holloway and her hired hand. The way he said the last words left no doubt about his meaning. Bit far from your own property, ain't you? Martha sat straight in her saddle. Just recovering my cattle, Bill. They broke through during the storm. Larson made a show of studying the animals. Don't see your brand on these cattle, ma'am. Look like double H stock to me. You know very well those are mine, Martha replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. The roan coloring marks James's breeding line. Harris doesn't have a single roan in his herd. The 2 men flanking Larson shifted uncomfortably, aware she was right. Larson's face hardened. Don't matter. They're on double H land now. That makes them double H property. That's not the law, and you know it, Martha said. Larson's hand moved closer to his gun. Law's what Mr. Harris says it is around here. Nakohi had remained silent, but Martha felt him tense beside her. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, 3 armed men against the 2 of them. Perhaps, Nakohi said suddenly, his voice calm and reasonable, we should ask Sheriff Turner to decide. Law says branded cattle remain owner's property, regardless of where they wander. He gestured toward the herd. Mrs. Holloway's brand is clear enough for any judge to see. Larson scowled at Nakohi. You threatening me, Indian? No threat, just suggesting law should decide. Nakohi maintained his composed demeanor. Unless Double H prefers to be known for cattle theft. The two other ranch hands exchanged glances. Cattle theft was a serious accusation, one that could damage Harris's standing in the community. We could all ride to town together, Martha added, sensing the shift in momentum. Let the sheriff examine the brands. I'm sure Mr. Harris wouldn't want any misunderstandings. Long seconds passed as Larson weighed his options. Finally, he spat on the ground. Take your damn cattle and get off our land. Mr. Harris will hear about this. I'm sure he will, Martha replied evenly. Please give him my regards. They worked quickly to round up the 6 strays, keeping a wary eye on Larson and his men who watched from the ridge. Only when they crossed back onto Holloway land did Martha release the breath she'd been holding. That was close, she murmured. Nakohi nodded. You handled them well. We handled them well, she corrected, a smile breaking across her face. I never thought I'd see Bill Larson back down like that. Men like him, Nakohi observed, rely on others' fear. When fear doesn't come, they don't know what to do. Back at the ranch, they herded the recovered cattle into the north pasture with the rest of the breeding stock. The animals moved eagerly toward the lush grass that might help save the ranch if given enough time. That evening, Martha prepared a special supper, venison stew with the last of her preserved vegetables, and cornbread with honey, a small celebration of their first victory. As they ate, she found herself laughing at Nakohi's understated description of Larson's face when confronted with the law. I haven't laughed like this in. Martha paused, realizing the truth of what she was about to say. Well, not since James was alive. Nakohi's eyes met hers across the table, warm in the lamplight. Laughter is good medicine. My people say it keeps the spirit strong. Your people are wise, Martha said softly, something fluttering in her chest that she wasn't quite ready to name. Rain drummed steadily against the windows, a gentle rhythm that had continued since midday. After a week of relentless work, moving cattle, preparing the timber stand for selective cutting, testing clay samples from the South Quarter, the forced confinement of a rainy day brought an unexpected respite. Martha sat at the kitchen table, mending a tear in one of her work shirts. Nakohi occupied the chair across from her, whittling a piece of pine with his small knife. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth and the scent of burning cedar. Will your men still arrive tomorrow if this keeps up? Martha asked, glancing toward the window where raindrops traced silver paths down the glass. Yes, rain doesn't stop Apache, Nakohi replied with the ghost of a smile. Especially for paid work. For men from the reservation would come to help with the timber harvesting, the first step in their plan to raise money for the bank payment. Martha had noticed how Nakohi seemed more animated when discussing their arrival, as if the prospect of his people working alongside him brought a particular satisfaction. Your people, she began hesitantly. Do they mind working for a white woman? Nakohi considered her question. Some might. These men don't. They want work, fair pay. He paused his carving. Told them you're honorable. They trust my word. The simple statement carried weight. Nakohi had vouched for her character to his people, just as she had begun to trust his judgment. I had a brother, Martha said unexpectedly. Thomas. He disapproved when I married James and moved west. She tied off a thread and snipped the excess. Said no decent woman would choose frontier life over proper society. You never mentioned a brother before. Haven't spoken to him in 15 years. Martha's hands stilled on the fabric. He refused to come to our wedding. Sent a letter saying I was dead to the family. Because you chose your own path, Nakohi observed. Because I chose a man who worked with his hands instead of his inheritance. She resumed her stitching. Thomas became a banker in Philadelphia. Ironic, isn't it? My brother in the same profession as the man trying to take my home. Nakohi was quiet for a moment, his knife making delicate shavings that curled onto the table. Family can be the deepest wound. Something in his tone made Martha look up. You too. He nodded slowly. When I returned from the white man's school, some of my people said I wasn't Apache anymore, that I'd lost my way. His hands continued their work, steady despite the painful memory. My father's brother refused to speak to me, said I'd chosen the enemy's path. That's not fair, Martha said, indignation coloring her voice. You were a child. You didn't choose to go. No, but I learned their ways, spoke their language. He met her eyes, walked between worlds. The rain intensified, pattering more urgently against the roof. Martha found herself studying Nakohi's face, the strong lines of his cheekbones, the quiet dignity in his expression, the depths of experience in his dark eyes. This man who had survived between cultures, neither fully accepted in either, yet maintaining his integrity through it all. Do you have a picture of your wife? She asked gently. Surprise flickered across his features. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, different from the medicine bag he wore around his neck. From it, he carefully extracted a faded photograph, its edges worn soft with handling. He passed it across the table. Martha took it carefully, aware of its preciousness. The image showed a young Apache woman with striking features and an intelligent gaze. She wore a mix of traditional dress and white-styled clothing. Like Nakohi, a person of two worlds. Kimi, he said simply. It means secret in my language. A school photographer took this before we married. She's beautiful, Martha said, meaning it. She looks kind. She was. Nakohi accepted the photograph back, his fingers brushing Martha's momentarily. You're James? Do you have his picture? Martha nodded, rising from the table. From the small cabinet in the corner, she retrieved a framed photograph. James Holloway at 35, strong and confident, his hand resting on a fence post of the ranch they'd built together. He looks like a man who knew his mind, Nakohi observed, studying the image. Stubborn as the day is long, Martha agreed with a sad smile. But fair. Always fair. They sat in companionable silence as the rain continued its steady percussion on the roof. Two people sharing not just their present struggles but the paths that had led them here, the losses, the estrangements, the choices that had shaped them. When Martha's hand accidentally brushed Nakohi's as they both reached for the coffee pot, neither pulled away immediately. The brief contact lingered between them, acknowledged but not discussed, like the shifting current of a river finding a new course. The sound of an approaching rider brought Martha to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning had been productive. Nakohi and the 4 Apache men he'd brought from the reservation had already felled 3 large pines from the north ridge, the first of the timber they hoped would help save the ranch. But this visitor wasn't another worker. The woman who rode toward the house sat straight and proud on her pinto, her long black hair braided with colorful beads that caught the sunlight. Her clothing was a practical blend of Apache and white styles. A calico blouse over a traditional skirt, leather boots instead of moccasins. Martha felt a flutter of unexpected jealousy. The woman was younger than her, perhaps 30, with a striking beauty that made Martha suddenly conscious of her own work-worn appearance and graying hair. Nakohi emerged from the barn, saw the rider, and broke into a broad smile unlike any expression Martha had seen on his face before. He called out something in Apache, his voice warm with welcome. The woman dismounted gracefully and embraced Nakohi. They spoke rapidly in their native tongue, the musical syllables incomprehensible to Martha but clearly affectionate. Martha, Nakohi said, turning toward the porch. This is my sister, Kiza. Sister. Martha felt ridiculous relief flood through her. Welcome to Holloway Ranch, she said, coming down the steps. Please come inside. You must be thirsty after your ride. Kiza regarded Martha with open curiosity. Thank you, she replied, her English clear but accented. My brother has spoken of you in his messages. In the kitchen, Martha poured coffee for the 3 of them, hyper-aware of Kiza's assessing gaze. The woman wore a beaded necklace of intricate design, turquoise and silver against deep red beads, the craftsmanship evident even to Martha's untrained eye. Your necklace is beautiful, Martha said, searching for common ground. Kiza's hand went to the beadwork. Our grandmother made it. A gift when I became a woman. Her direct gaze met Martha's. She taught me the old ways of our people. The ways some tried to make us forget. There was a challenge in the words, a protective edge that made Martha understand. Kiza was here not just to see her brother, but to evaluate the white woman he was helping. Kiza is a healer, Nakohi explained, a note of pride in his voice. The best on the reservation. People come from far to seek her knowledge. A healer? Like a doctor? Martha asked. Our medicine is different than white doctors, Kiza replied. We heal the whole person, not just the body. She sipped her coffee, studying Martha over the rim of the cup. My brother says you fight to keep your land. Martha nodded. The bank and my neighbor want to take it. We're trying to raise enough money to pay the loan. We, Kiza repeated, glancing between Martha and Nakohi. You work together now. Yes, Martha said simply. We do. Something passed between the siblings. A look Martha couldn't interpret. Then Kiza reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a small package wrapped in leather. For your wounds, she said, placing it on the table. The men cutting timber will need it. Pine sap and herbs. Better than white man's medicine for cuts. Thank you, Martha said, touched by the practical gift. That's very kind. Not kind. Useful. Kiza's expression softened slightly. My brother would not stay if you were not worthy of help. I trust his judgment. As the day progressed, Martha found herself working alongside Kiza, preparing meals for the timber crew and tending to a minor cut one of the men received. The initial awkwardness between them gradually eased as they discovered a shared practicality, a similar no-nonsense approach to work. In the late afternoon, Martha overheard Kiza speaking to Nakohi in their language as they sat on the porch. Though she couldn't understand the words, their tone was serious, intimate. When Kiza glanced her way, Martha busied herself with the garden, pretending not to notice. Later, as they prepared supper, Kiza surprised Martha by asking, How did you meet your husband, James? Martha smiled at the memory. He was building a stone wall on my father's property in Ohio. I brought him water one day, and he told me I had the most practical hands he'd ever seen on a lady. Kiza laughed, a warm, rich sound. A strange compliment. I thought so too. But then he explained that most ladies he met had soft, idle hands that had never done a day's work. He said my hands showed character. Martha looked down at her work-roughened fingers. No one had ever valued that about me before. My brother has practical hands too, Kiza observed casually. Strong but gentle. Good for building things that last. Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication. He's been a great help to the ranch, she said carefully. The ranch, Kiza repeated with a knowing smile. Of course. That evening, as Kiza prepared to leave, she took Martha's hands in hers. When Nakohi's wife died, I thought his heart died too. Now I see it still beats. Her dark eyes, so like her brother's, held Martha's gaze. Take care with it. It is stronger than he knows. Before Martha could respond, Kiza mounted her horse and called out to Nakohi, who stood nearby. He approached, and she leaned down to speak to him once more in their language. Whatever she said made him glance quickly at Martha, then back to his sister with an expression Martha couldn't read. As Kiza rode away, the beads in her hair catching the last rays of sunlight, Martha found herself standing beside Nakohi, wondering what had passed between the siblings and what it might mean for the fragile new feeling growing between herself and this quiet man who had become so unexpectedly essential to her life. The journey to Copper Creek took just over 2 hours by wagon. Martha sat beside Nakohi on the bench seat, the morning sun warming their shoulders as they approached the small frontier town. Behind them, 2 Apache workers followed on horseback, leading the half-dozen cattle they'd selected to sell at the weekly market. Been a while since I've gone to town, Martha admitted, adjusting her best bonnet. A faded blue thing that had once been quite fashionable. Not since James died, really? Nakohi nodded, understanding. Small towns had long memories and longer tongues. A widow living alone was subject to enough gossip without providing fresh fodder. And now I'll be arriving with 3 Apache men, she added with a wry smile. That should give them something to talk about. We could turn back, Nakohi offered quietly. Martha straightened her shoulders. Not a chance. We need the money from these cattle, and I'm not about to hide like I've done something wrong. As they crested the final hill, Copper Creek came into view. Single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church steeple rising above the general store, the livery stable at the far end where the cattle market would be held. They were noticed immediately. Heads turned as the unusual party made their way down the main street. Martha felt the stares but kept her gaze forward, her back straight. "Mrs. Holloway," called Mr. Peterson from the doorway of his general store. His greeting was polite, but his eyes darted nervously to her companions. "Haven't seen you in town for some time." "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," she replied with calm dignity. "Just bringing some cattle to market." Other townspeople emerged from shops and offices, drawn by the novelty of Martha Holloway in the company of Apache men. Whispers followed them down the street. At the livery, the market was already busy with ranchers and traders. The cattle pens bustled with activity as buyers assessed the stock available. Martha and Nakohi made their way to the auction office to register their cattle for sale. Inside, the clerk looked up and froze, pen hovering over his ledger. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Morning, Charlie," Martha said briskly. "I've brought 6 head to sell. Prime breeding stock." She placed her bill of sale on the counter. Charlie glanced at Nakohi, then back to Martha. Yes, ma'am. Just need you to sign here." He pushed the ledger toward her, then added hesitantly, "Your help can wait outside." "Mr. Nakohi is my business partner, not my help," Martha corrected firmly. "He'll be signing as well." A heavy silence fell over the small office. Charlie looked as though she'd suggested something scandalous. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm not sure that's... Is there a problem here?" The booming voice of Clayton Harris filled the doorway. He stepped inside, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Martha, what a surprise! And with interesting company. Martha felt Nakohi tense beside her, but he remained silent, his face impassive. "Just registering our cattle for sale, Clayton," she replied coolly. "Our cattle?" Harris raised his eyebrows, looking between them. My, things have progressed, haven't they?" He turned to the clerk. "Charlie, surely you're not considering allowing an Indian to sign official market documents?" "The law doesn't prohibit it," Martha said before Charlie could respond. "Mr. Nakohi is a literate, free citizen." Harris laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Listen to you. Next you'll be telling us he's fit to vote or hold property." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Martha, you're making a spectacle of yourself. Think about what James would say, seeing you here with this arrangement." "James would say I'm doing what's necessary to save our ranch," she replied evenly. "And he'd respect a man who works honestly, regardless of his heritage." Harris's face hardened. "Well, I think you've lost your senses. Letting an Apache sleep on your property, work your land, sign your papers." He looked directly at Nakohi now. "People are talking, you know, about what other services he might be providing the lonely widow Holloway." Martha felt heat rush to her face. Anger, not shame. "That's enough, Clayton." "Just concerned for your reputation, Martha," Harris replied with false solicitude. "And your safety. These people have a history of violence, after all." Nakohi finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying. "The only threat to Mrs. Holloway seems to be from men trying to take her land through paper and lies." A murmur ran through the growing crowd of onlookers. Harris's face flushed dark with anger. "You'd better watch your tongue, boy." "Mr. Harris," Martha interjected firmly, "we came to sell our cattle, not engage in petty arguments. Now, are you buying today or simply wasting everyone's time?" For a tense moment, Harris looked as though he might say more. Then he forced a cold smile. "Oh, I'll be buying today, but not from you." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Enjoy your time in town, Martha. I imagine it will be your last as a ranch owner." After he left, Charlie reluctantly processed their paperwork, his hands shaking slightly as he handed Martha a receipt for the cattle. The small slip of paper represented their first concrete step toward saving the ranch, if they could get a fair price at auction. "Don't worry about Harris," Martha told Nakohi as they left the office. "His bark is worse than his bite." "It's not his bark that concerns me," Nakohi replied, his eyes scanning the crowd of ranchers who watched them with undisguised hostility. "It's the pack that follows him." The cattle sold for a better price than Martha had dared hope. Not enough to pay off the bank, but enough to buy them more time and materials for their other ventures. The ride home had been quiet, each of them processing the day's events. The stares, the whispers, Harris's public confrontation. Dawn broke clear the next morning, promising another day of perfect weather for the timber operation. Martha stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, surveying the activity already underway. The Apache workers moved with practiced efficiency, preparing tools and hitching horses to the wagon that would transport logs from the North Ridge. Nakohi emerged from the barn, leading his paint horse. They hadn't spoken much since returning from town, a new awkwardness between them born of Harris's crude insinuations. "Heading to the ridge?" Martha called, needing to break the silence. He nodded. "Want to check the next section for cutting. Men will follow soon." She watched him ride away, his straight back and proud carriage a familiar sight now. How quickly she'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet strength he brought to each task. Harris's words echoed uncomfortably in her mind. People are talking. Of course they were. A widow and an Apache man working closely together, defying convention and expectation. Martha pushed the thoughts away and focused on her own tasks for the day. The clay samples they'd collected from the South Quarter needed testing. If the quality was good enough, they might have another source of income. Bricks were always in demand for new construction in the growing territory. Mid-morning found her inspecting the western fence line, making notes of sections that would need repair before the next storm season. The ranch was beginning to feel alive again, purposeful. Not just a place she was desperately trying to hold on to, but a home with a future. The sound of running hooves pulled her from her thoughts. One of the Apache workers, Tarak, the youngest, rode toward her at a gallop. His expression told her something was wrong before he even spoke. "Mrs. Holloway, come quick. The north fence cut in the night. Cattle getting out." Martha mounted her horse immediately. "How bad?" "3 posts down. Wire cut clean." Tarak's eyes were grave. "Not accident. Someone did this." They rode hard to the north boundary where they found Nakohi and the other men already working to repair the damage. 5 fence posts had been deliberately sawed through near the base, the barbed wire cut in multiple places. A section of fence nearly 30 feet long lay collapsed. But worse than the fence was what Martha saw beyond it. The watering hole that served this section of her property had been fouled. Someone had dumped something into it, turning the water a sickly color that kept the cattle away. "Who would do this?" she asked, dismounting beside Nakohi. His expression was grim. "Someone who wants your cattle weak or dead, or forced to find water elsewhere." He pointed to Harris's property visible across the rolling landscape. "Like there." Martha felt cold fury building inside her. "Harris, this is how he plans to take my land, damage what he can't buy." "No proof," Nakohi cautioned, though his eyes suggested he agreed with her assessment. "I don't need proof to know," Martha replied, kneeling to examine one of the cut posts. The work had been done with a saw, the cuts clean and deliberate. This wasn't random vandalism. This was planned. As they worked to repair the fence, Martha's mind raced. The cattle would need water. They could drive them to the eastern creek for now, but that meant less grazing time, thinner cattle, lower prices at market. Exactly what Harris wanted. "We should report this to the sheriff," she said as they secured a new post. Nakohi gave her a measured look. "Sheriff Turner is Harris's cousin by marriage. So there's no justice to be had," Martha concluded bitterly. "Not from his law." Nakohi hammered the fence wire into place with controlled force. "We make our own justice. Protect what's yours." By late afternoon, They had repaired the fence and begun the process of leading the cattle to the eastern water source. Martha worked alongside the men, her anger giving her energy. When a broken fence post splintered in her hands, she barely noticed the sharp wood cutting into her palm until Nakohi gently took her wrist. "You're bleeding," he said, examining the jagged gash. "It's nothing," she replied, trying to pull away. "Not nothing." His grip remained firm but gentle. "Come. Need to clean it." At the water barrel near the repaired fence, he carefully washed the dirt from her wound. His touch was tender, his large hands surprisingly delicate as they cradled hers. Martha found herself studying his face, the concentration in his eyes, the slight furrow between his brows. "Harris won't stop," she said quietly. "Not until he has my land. Then we don't stop either." Nakohi's eyes met hers, determination evident in their depths. "This is your home, worth fighting for." "Our fight now," Martha corrected, the words escaping before she could consider them. "You've made it yours too." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth, a recognition. His hand continued to hold hers even though the wound was clean now. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Our fight." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Martha felt her heart quicken, aware of how close they stood, how his touch sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. A call from one of the workers broke the spell. Nakohi released her hand reluctantly, wrapping a clean bandana around her palm. "Should heal clean," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. That night, Martha stood on her porch, looking out at the land that had become the center of a battle she never wanted. The broken fence post she'd examined earlier lay against the porch railing, evidence of Harris's escalation, a warning of what might come next. The question was no longer if Harris would make another move, but when and how much damage he was willing to do to get what he wanted. The sound of approaching riders brought Martha and Nakohi to the front porch. 3 men on horseback crested the hill, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. Martha recognized Clayton Harris's imposing figure immediately. Beside him rode Emmett Walsh from the bank, and behind them, a stranger whose holstered gun gleamed prominently against his dark coat. "Trouble?" Nakohi said quietly, moving to stand beside her. Martha nodded, her hand instinctively touching the pocket where she kept her father's watch. They wouldn't come together unless they thought they had the upper hand. The 3 men rode into the yard and dismounted with deliberate slowness. Harris adjusted his expensive vest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Walsh clutched a leather portfolio, his nervous glances at the hired gun revealing his discomfort with whatever plan they'd hatched. "Afternoon, Martha," Harris called, his false joviality grating on her nerves. His eyes slid to Nakohi with undisguised contempt. "Still keeping interesting company, I see." "State your business, Clayton," Martha replied coldly. "I've got work to do." Harris chuckled. "Always direct. I've always admired that about you." He gestured to Walsh. "Emmett here has some papers you'll want to see." Walsh stepped forward, extracting a document from his portfolio. "Mrs. Holloway, in light of recent developments, the bank has reassessed your loan situation." He thrust the paper toward her. "We're foreclosing, effective immediately." Martha took the document, scanning its contents with growing fury. "This is ridiculous. The deadline you gave me hasn't even passed." "New information has come to light," Walsh replied, not meeting her eyes. "Regarding the original loan terms." "What new information?" Martha demanded. Harris stepped closer, his bulk imposing as he mounted the porch steps. "Seems your dear departed husband wasn't as forthright as you believed. James borrowed against this property multiple times, Martha. Some of those loans were from me." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a lie. James would never." "Oh, but he did." Harris produced another document from his coat pocket. "This deed shows he used the North Ridge timber stand as collateral for a private loan." "My loan? I never saw this." James never mentioned. "Men keep secrets from their wives all the time," Harris said with false sympathy. especially when they're in over their heads. He nodded toward the deed in her hand. That's my rightful property now. The rest will follow soon enough once the bank forecloses. Martha felt as though the ground were shifting beneath her feet. Could James really have hidden such important matters from her? They'd always made decisions together, faced every challenge as partners. Nakohi's voice broke through her confusion. Convenient timing, he observed. Just when timber is being cut, water poisoned. The stranger behind Harris shifted, his hand moving closer to his gun. Watch your mouth, Indian. No need for unpleasantness, Harris said smoothly. I'm simply here to claim what's legally mine and offer Martha a solution. He turned to her, all business now. Sign over the ranch today, and I'll let you stay on in the house. You can keep a small garden plot, maybe a few chickens. More than generous, considering. Martha stared at the deed in her hand, then at the foreclosure notice. Something wasn't right. James had been meticulous about their finances, proud of how they'd built the ranch together. He wouldn't have hidden debts or made secret deals, especially not with Clayton Harris, whom he'd never trusted. She looked up at Harris, studying his face, the barely contained triumph in his eyes, the certainty that he'd won. Then at Walsh, whose nervous fidgeting spoke of a man uncomfortable with his role in this scheme. No, Martha said firmly, handing the papers back. I don't believe you, and I'm not signing anything. Harris's pleasant facade cracked. Don't be a fool, Martha. You're finished here. The bank will take everything within the week. Then let them try, she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But I won't hand over what's mine based on suspicious papers you've suddenly produced. Harris's face darkened. He nodded to the hired gun, who stepped forward. Maybe you need some persuasion, some demonstration of how serious we are. The man drew his pistol, aiming not at Martha or Nakohi but toward the barn where Thunder was stabled. Shame if something happened to that fine stallion, or if a fire broke out in the barn. Nakohi moved with surprising speed, positioning himself between the gun and the barn. You threaten with violence because your lies fail, he said calmly. Mark of a weak man. The gunman sneered. Step aside, Apache, or you'll be the first to. The sound of rifles being cocked cut him off. From the corner of the barn, 2 of the Apache workers emerged, weapons raised. A third appeared from behind the house, his aim steady on Harris. Seems we're at an impasse, Martha observed coolly. Now I suggest you leave my property before things get unpleasant. Harris's face contorted with rage. This isn't over, Martha. Not by a long shot. He turned to Walsh. Come on. We'll handle this through proper channels. As they mounted their horses, Harris called back. Enjoy your Apache protectors while you can. People in town are already talking about the widow Holloway and her savage friends. Won't be long before someone decides to do something about it. After they rode away, Martha's composure finally broke. She sank onto the porch step, the deed still clutched in her hand. Could James really have hidden this from me? Made deals with Harris behind my back? Nakohi sat beside her, his presence steadying. Paper is easy to create, he said quietly, especially when the man who could challenge it is dead. Martha looked at him, understanding dawning. You think it's forged? That Harris created this deed after James died. Would explain why it appears now, when we begin to fight back. He took the document, examining it carefully. Need to check dates, signatures. Find proof. Martha felt hope flicker through her despair. If we could prove Harris forged documents, would destroy his standing, turn others against him. Nakohi's eyes met hers, determination clear. But first we must prepare. They will return with more men next time. As dusk settled over the ranch, Martha stood watching the horizon where Harris and his men had disappeared. The rejected deed lay on her kitchen table, a declaration of war as surely as the damaged fence and poisoned water. We'll be ready, she said softly, her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. This is our land, our home. Martha stared at the legal document spread before her on the kitchen table. Lamplight cast long shadows across the paper that had shattered her understanding of her marriage and her husband. She'd found it buried in James's old trunk, a loan agreement with Clayton Harris, signed in her husband's hand 3 months before his death. "It's real," she said quietly as Nakohi entered the kitchen. "James did borrow from Harris. $500. Nakohi set down the lantern he carried and moved to examine the document. His expression remained neutral, but Martha sensed his concern. "Does it mention land as collateral?" "No." Martha traced her finger along the terms written in precise legal language. "It was a personal loan with interest. Nothing about the timber rights or any part of the ranch." "So Harris lied about that part," Nakohi observed. "But the debt is real." Martha nodded, hollow feeling spreading through her chest. "James never told me. All those months when I thought we were managing, he was secretly borrowing money." She looked up at Nakohi, confusion and hurt evident in her eyes. "Why would he hide this from me? We always faced everything together." Nakohi pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Men sometimes protect those they love from worry, think they carry burden alone." "It wasn't protection," Martha replied, an edge of anger in her voice. "It was deception. If I'd known how bad things were, we could have found solutions together." She stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. For 15 years, she'd believed her marriage was built on honesty and partnership. Now she questioned everything. Had there been other secrets? Other lies told with good intentions? "James was a proud man," she said finally. "Maybe too proud to admit he was struggling." She paused at the window, staring out at the darkened ranch. But why borrow from Harris of all people? "He knew Clayton had always wanted our land." "Desperate men make dangerous choices," Nakohi said quietly, "when no other path seems open." Martha turned back to him, studying his face in the lamplight. "Is that why you're helping me? You think I'm desperate?" Something flickered in his dark eyes, hurt, perhaps. "Is that what you believe?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," Martha admitted, sinking back into her chair. "The man I thought I knew better than anyone kept secrets that now threaten everything we built. How can I trust my judgment about anything? About anyone?" The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the newly repaired window frames. A storm was brewing, both outside and within. "My wife kept secrets too," Nakohi said finally, his voice low. "Before she died. Was sick longer than she told me. Didn't want me to worry." His hands, usually so steady, fidgeted with the edge of the document. "When I found out, was angry. Felt betrayed." Martha looked up, surprised by this personal revelation. "What did you do?" "Nothing. She died before I could." He paused, collecting himself. Carried that anger a long time. Anger at her for hiding truth. Anger at myself for not seeing. "How did you let it go?" Martha asked softly. "Realized her secret came from love," he replied. "Wrong kind, maybe. Mistaken kind. But still love." Martha felt tears threaten, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, focusing on the document before her. "Even if James borrowed this money out of love, it doesn't change our situation. Harris is using this debt to take everything. But changes how we fight," Nakohi pointed out. "Now we know truth. Harris altered original agreement, added timber rights later." He tapped the paper. "This proves his fraud." A new determination straightened Martha's spine. "You're right. This doesn't give him claim to our land. It's just a personal debt." She stood, a plan forming. "We need to find out if there are other documents. If Harris forged this one, there could be more." "Town Records Office," Nakohi suggested. "All land transactions registered there." "And the bank," Martha added. "Walsh might be working with Harris, but other bank employees could help us if they know about the fraud." As they outlined their strategy, Martha felt the betrayal of James's secret gradually being channeled into something productive. A renewed commitment to save their home. Their home. The thought gave her pause. When had she started thinking of the ranch as belonging to both her and Nakohi? "We should rest," Nakohi said, noting her fatigue. "Tomorrow comes early." Martha nodded, gathering the document to return it to its hiding place. At the doorway she paused. "Thank you," she said, not quite looking at him, "for helping me see this clearly, for not judging James. Or me." "No judgment," Nakohi replied simply. "Only understanding." As he turned to leave for the barn where he slept, Martha found herself saying, "The spare room is made up. It's supposed to rain tonight." When he hesitated, she added, "No sense in getting soaked walking to the barn." Their eyes met across the dimly lit kitchen, both aware of the line being crossed. Not just a hired hand anymore. Not just a business partner. Something neither was ready to name. "Thank you," he said finally, his deep voice gentle in the quiet house. That night, as rain drummed steadily on the roof, Martha lay awake thinking about secrets, trust, and the unexpected ways life could change course. How a man hired for one day's work could become essential to her world, how betrayal could lead to new beginnings, and how the heart could heal and open again when given the chance. The wooden token lay in Nakohi's palm, circular, carved with symbols Martha didn't recognize. He had returned from the reservation the previous evening with news that made her heart both sink and soar. Harris and Walsh were planning to bring the sheriff out to the ranch tomorrow to enforce the supposed foreclosure. But Nakohi hadn't come back alone. "My people stand with us," he explained, holding up the token. "This is from the tribal council, a symbol of their support." Outside, the yard was filled with activity. For more Apache men had arrived with Nakohi, joining the workers already helping at the ranch. But more surprisingly, two neighboring small ranchers, Peterson and Gunderson, had ridden in at dawn, offering their support. They'd always been civil but distant neighbors, careful to maintain good relations with Harris. Their presence now represented a significant shift. "Harris pushed too far," Peterson had explained gruffly when Martha expressed her surprise. "Man forges documents against one rancher. Who's to say we're not next?" Martha watched from the porch as Nakohi directed the men in preparations. The past 2 days had been a whirlwind of activity. Their visit to the county records office had yielded the evidence they needed. The original registration of her land showed no encumbrances or liens. Harris's claim to the timber rights was provably false. But the bank loan remained a problem. While they had evidence that Walsh had improperly accelerated the terms, they still needed to make a payment to stave off legitimate foreclosure. "Mrs. Holloway?" Peterson approached the porch, hat in hand. "The men are asking where you want the extra rifles positioned." Martha blinked, pulled from her thoughts. "Rifles? I thought we were making a legal stand, not a military one." "With respect, ma'am, it's best to be prepared for both." Peterson's weathered face was grim. Harris isn't known for taking defeat gracefully. Inside the house, Martha found Nakohi at the kitchen table with Gunderson, reviewing a roughly drawn map of the ranch. "Sheriff will come by the main road," Gunderson was saying. "Harris and his men might split up, approach from multiple directions." "I won't have bloodshed on my land," Martha said firmly, joining them at the table. Nakohi looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "No one wants that. But Harris brought armed men last time. We'll bring more tomorrow. Showing we can defend ourselves might prevent violence, not cause it," Gunderson added. Martha sighed, recognizing the wisdom in their words. "Fine, but defensive positions only. No one fires unless fired upon." As the men returned to their planning, Martha retreated to her bedroom. From her dresser drawer, she removed a small box containing the money they'd managed to gather, proceeds from the cattle sale, advance payment for timber, and a surprising contribution from the tribal council Nakohi had brought back with him. It wasn't enough to pay off the loan completely, but it might buy them time if the bank could be persuaded to accept a partial payment. If not, tomorrow would determine whether she kept her home or lost everything. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her calculations. Nakohi stood in the doorway, hesitant to enter her private space. "Peterson's wife arrived," he said. "Brought food for everyone. Asked if you would join us." Martha nodded, returning the money box to its hiding place. As she moved to the door, Nakohi remained where he was, studying her face. "You're worried," he observed. "Aren't you?" she countered. "Tomorrow could end badly for everyone involved." "Could," he agreed. "Or could be the day we win back your ranch for good." "Our ranch," she corrected quietly. The words hung between them, significant and undeniable. Something softened in Nakohi's expression. "Martha," he began, her name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before. "Don't," she said quickly. "Not yet. Not when tomorrow is so uncertain." He nodded, understanding. "After, then." "After," she agreed, her heart beating faster despite her resolve to focus on the challenges ahead. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. By nightfall, the ranch had been transformed. Men stationed at strategic points, supplies distributed, plans refined. Martha moved among them, bringing coffee and food, listening to their strategies, offering suggestions about the layout of the land. As darkness settled, she found herself beside the corral where Thunder watched the unusual activity with alert interest. Nakohi joined her, his silent presence comforting in a way she'd grown to rely upon. "I never expected this," Martha said, gesturing to the people gathered around campfires in her yard. "All these people willing to stand with us. Standing against injustice," Nakohi replied, "and for something worth protecting." "And what is that exactly?" she asked, turning to face him fully. "What makes my small ranch worth all this?" Nakohi was quiet for a long moment, his profile strong against the firelight. "For some, it's principle. For others, self-interest against Harris." He met her gaze directly. "For me, it's simpler." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cool evening air. "And what would that be?" "Home," he said simply. "Worth fighting for." The word contained multitudes. Not just the land or buildings, but the life they'd begun to build together. The partnership that had grown from employer and worker to something far more profound. Tomorrow would bring Sheriff Turner, Harris, Walsh, and whatever men they mustered. Tomorrow would determine whether legal rights prevailed over power and corruption. Tomorrow would decide the fate of Holloway Ranch. But tonight, standing beside Nakohi in the gathering darkness, Martha found herself facing a truth she could no longer deny. Whatever happened with the ranch, her heart had already found its home. A year had passed since the day Sheriff Turner rode onto Holloway Ranch with Clayton Harris, Emmett Walsh, and 6 hired guns. A year since Martha had stood on her porch, documents in hand, Nakohi beside her, as the truth about Harris's land schemes was finally exposed. The wooden bands on their fingers caught the morning light as Martha and Nakohi sat on the porch, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. The simple rings he had carved from the wood of the first fence they'd repaired together had been exchanged 4 months ago, in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with frontier practicality. "First big storm of the season coming," Nakohi observed, his eyes tracking the darkness building to the west. Martha nodded, her hand finding his naturally. "Roofs sound, fences are strong. We're ready." Ready in ways they couldn't have imagined a year ago. The confrontation that day had nearly turned violent. Harris ordering his men to clear the property, Sheriff Turner hesitating when presented with the evidence of fraud, tensions mounting as armed ranchers and Apache warriors stood their ground around the Holloway homestead. It was Gunderson who had broken the stalemate, producing additional documents showing Harris had attempted similar fraud against his own father years before. Then Peterson revealed a signed statement from a bank clerk detailing how Walsh had altered loan documents on Harris's behalf. One by one, Harris's schemes had unraveled in front of the gathered crowd. The sheriff, conscious of witnesses and his own reputation, had been forced to acknowledge the evidence. Harris had raged, threatening everyone present, until Turner finally arrested him for attempted fraud and making violent threats. The legal battles had continued for months afterward. Martha had testified in town, enduring whispers and stares as she detailed Harris's attempts to steal her land. Nakohi had faced even worse, thinly veiled racism from townspeople uncomfortable with an Apache man speaking in court, challenging a prominent white rancher. But justice, slow and imperfect, had eventually prevailed. Harris had been convicted and fined heavily. Walsh had lost his position at the bank. And Martha had negotiated new terms for her loan with the bank's new manager, using the timber and clay proceeds to make a substantial payment. "Think Harris will come back when he's released?" Martha asked, voicing the concern that occasionally still troubled her sleep. Nakohi squeezed her hand gently. "Don't think so. Lost too much here. Pride. Standing. Money." He shrugged. "Men like Harris need those things more than revenge." Thunder rumbled in the distance. The horses in the corral grew restless, sensing the approaching storm. From inside the house came the sound of Kiza singing softly. She had come to stay for a few weeks, bringing medicinal herbs and news from the reservation. "Would you change anything?" Martha asked suddenly. "If you could go back to that first day, when I hired you just to fix a fence?" Nakohi considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "No," he said finally. "Every step led here, even the hard ones." Martha nodded, understanding. The journey hadn't been easy, weathering public disapproval of their relationship, working to integrate their different traditions, building a partnership that respected both their cultures. There had been painful moments, misunderstandings, and times when the weight of others' judgment had seemed unbearable. Yet here they were, stronger for having faced those challenges together. The ranch was thriving under their joint care, the cattle herd rebuilding, the timber being selectively and sustainably harvested, the clay operation producing bricks that were gaining a reputation for quality throughout the territory. More importantly, they had created something neither had thought possible after losing their first spouses. A home filled with shared purpose, mutual respect, and deep love. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as they rose from their seats. Martha cast a satisfied glance over the ranch, at the strong fences, the healthy cattle, the new outbuilding constructed from their own timber and bricks. Everything they had fought for, worked for, built together. "Let's go in," she said, as the rain began to fall more steadily. "Storms here." Nakohi nodded, his arms slipping naturally around her waist as they moved toward the door. "Good thing we're ready for it." Martha smiled up at him, remembering the wary, grieving woman she had been when he first arrived. The woman who had hired an Apache for one day's work and found a lifetime of partnership. "Yes," she agreed, leaning into his solid presence. "Together, we're ready for anything." As they stepped inside, the rain came down in earnest, drumming on the roof they had repaired side by side. But inside was warmth and light, the smell of coffee and fresh bread, and the certainty that this home they had fought so hard to save had become something far more precious than either could have imagined. Not just a place, but a shared life, built one day at a time through small kindnesses, steadfast loyalty, and love that had grown quietly, unassumingly, yet powerfully between them. The storm could rage, the winds could blow, but Martha and Nakohi had weathered worse together. And in doing so, had discovered that the strongest structures aren't always built of wood or stone or brick, but of trust, respect, and love that endures through all seasons.